The Chronicles of the Eternal Flame. Chapter 1. The Night of Lightning. The wind roared through the village of Emberfall. The night sky was torn apart by flashes of lightning, not the normal kind, but glowing streaks of red and gold. People ran through the streets, shouting warnings. The ground shook as if something powerful had awakened beneath the earth. Lyra, a young apprentice mage, stood at the window of her small house. She held her hands tightly together, trying to calm her nerves. Her mentor, Elder Myra, had left the village that morning, leaving Lyra to care for the small herb shop. Suddenly, the air became heavy, and Lyra felt a strange pull in her chest. "What is happening?" she whispered. A loud boom echoed through the night. Lyra rushed outside, her heart pounding. At the center of the village square, flames rose high into the air. Around the flames stood a group of hooded figures, chanting in a strange, sharp language. "Stop them!" someone screamed. The village guards rushed forward, swords drawn, but the hooded figures raised their hands. A wave of fire shot out, forcing the guards back. Lyra stared in shock. "They're breaking the fire crystal," she realized. She had read about the crystal in Elder Myra's books. It was one of the 4 sources of magic in the world. Without it, fire magic would vanish, and the balance of power would crumble. Before she could move, a hand grabbed her shoulder. She spun around to see a tall man with dark armor and piercing green eyes. His face was hidden by a hood, but his voice was sharp and commanding. "You need to leave. Now." Lyra shook her head. "Who are you? What's happening?" The man glanced at the fire and the hooded figures. "There's no time. If they succeed, everything will change. You're in danger just by being here." Lyra hesitated. "But my village, my people. They'll burn if you stay," he snapped. Just as he spoke, the largest hooded figure raised both hands to the sky. A blinding flash of light exploded from the fire. The crystal, which had floated above the flames, cracked with a deafening sound. Pieces of it shattered and fell like glowing embers. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She felt the pull in her chest grow stronger, like something inside her was reacting to the broken crystal. The hooded figures laughed and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the village in flames. The mysterious man grabbed her arm. "You've seen too much. The world is about to change, and you're part of it now." Lyra didn't understand, but she let him pull her away from the chaos. Behind them, Emberfall burned, and the storm raged on. Chapter 2. The Shadow Warrior. Lyra stumbled through the forest, her legs aching and her mind spinning with questions. The man who had dragged her away from the burning village had disappeared as soon as they reached the edge of the woods. He left no explanation, only a warning: "Stay hidden. They'll come for you now." The forest was quiet, except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. Lyra sat by a tree, trying to catch her breath. She looked down at her hands, which still tingled from the strange pull she had felt when the fire crystal shattered. "What do I do now?" she whispered. A twig snapped behind her. Lyra froze, her heart racing. She turned her head slowly and saw a figure standing in the shadows. The man stepped closer, revealing a tall, lean frame. He wore a dark cloak, and a sword rested at his side. His face was scarred, and his eyes were cold, almost empty. "Who are you?" Lyra asked, her voice shaking. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, as if deciding whether she was a threat. Finally he said, "Kale." Lyra stood up, keeping her distance. Why are you following me? Cale raised an eyebrow. Following you? You're the one sitting on my path. She frowned. Your path. Cale sighed and pulled a rolled-up piece of parchment from his cloak. He unwrapped it to reveal a map, marked with symbols Lyra didn't recognize. At the center was an image of a shattered crystal. Her eyes widened. That's the fire crystal. Cale's expression darkened. It was. Now it's broken, and the pieces are scattered across the land. Lyra took a step closer, her fear replaced by curiosity. You know where the fragments are. Cale folded the map quickly. I know enough. And I know people are willing to kill for this. Before Lyra could ask more, the sound of distant shouts echoed through the trees. Cale's hand went to his sword, his body tensing like a coiled spring. They've found us, he said sharply. Lyra's stomach dropped. Who? Cale glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. The ones who broke the crystal. They won't let anyone interfere. He turned and started walking quickly through the trees. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then ran after him. Wait. You can't just leave me here. Cale stopped and looked back at her. You're a liability. Go hide. Lyra glared at him. You think they won't find me? If they're after you, they're after me too. I saw what they did to my village. Cale studied her for a moment, then sighed. Fine. Stay close and stay quiet. The two moved through the forest, the shouts growing louder behind them. Lyra's heart pounded as she followed Cale, who seemed to know exactly where to go. Finally, they reached a small cave hidden behind thick bushes. Cale ducked inside and Lyra followed. Inside, Cale lit a small lantern, revealing a pile of supplies. Food, weapons, and a few books. How do you know so much about the crystal? Lyra asked, her voice low. Cale didn't look at her. He sat down and began sharpening his sword. Because I've been hunting its power for years. But it's cursed. Everyone who touches it pays a price. Lyra frowned. What do you mean? Cale's eyes darkened. I used to be part of the army that guards the crystals. We thought we were protecting the world, but we were wrong. The crystal doesn't just give power. It takes something in return. Lyra shivered. What did it take from you? Cale didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and grabbed the map. We need to move. The longer we stay, the easier it will be for them to track us. Lyra followed him out of the cave, her mind filled with questions. She didn't trust Cale completely, but she knew one thing. If he had a way to find the crystal fragments, she had to stay with him. As they disappeared deeper into the forest, shadows moved behind them. An unseen army was closing in, and Lyra knew this was only the beginning of their fight. Chapter 3. The Forest of Spirits. The forest ahead of them looked alive. Its trees were tall and twisted, their branches weaving together like a giant web. A soft mist hung in the air, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Lyra and Cale stood at the edge, staring into the eerie shadows. This is the Whispering Forest, Cale said. His voice was low, almost a whisper itself. Lyra glanced at him nervously. Why does it feel strange? Cale tightened his grip on his sword. Because it's not just a forest. Spirits live here. They don't take kindly to trespassers. Lyra's stomach churned, but she forced herself to stay calm. Do we have to go through it? Cale nodded. If we want to follow the map, there's no other way. They stepped into the forest. The air immediately felt heavier, as if invisible eyes were watching them. The trees creaked and groaned, their bark twisting into shapes that almost looked like faces. Lyra shivered. "I don't like this." "Keep moving," Kale said. "And don't listen to the voices." "What voices?" Lyra asked, her heart skipping a beat. Before Kale could answer, a soft whisper floated through the air. "Why are you here?" Lyra froze. The voice was faint like the rustling of leaves, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. She looked around, but there was no one there. "Don't stop," Kale said sharply, pulling her forward. "It's the spirits. They're testing us." They walked deeper into the forest. The whispers grew louder, overlapping each other until they sounded like 100 voices speaking at once. "Turn back. You don't belong here. Prove your worth." Lyra covered her ears, but the voices didn't stop. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and fell to the ground. Kale helped her up. "Focus. They're trying to scare you." "But why?" Lyra asked, her voice shaking. Kale looked around cautiously. "Spirits guard places of power. They want to see if we're strong enough to pass." As they walked, the forest seemed to change. The trees shifted, their branches reaching out like hands. A path that had been clear one moment was suddenly blocked the next. Then the whispers stopped. The silence was almost worse. Lyra looked around. "What's happening now?" Before Kale could answer, a tree ahead of them groaned and bent low. Its bark split open, revealing a glowing figure inside. The figure stepped out, a spirit, its body made of light and mist. It had no face, but its presence was overwhelming. "Who are you?" the spirit asked, its voice echoing like a distant bell. Kale stepped forward, his hand on his sword. "We're travelers seeking the fragments of the fire crystal." The spirit turned its head toward Lyra. "And you, child? Why do you walk this path?" Lyra hesitated. She felt the pull in her chest again, stronger now, as if the forest was drawing something out of her. "I want to protect my world," she said. The spirit tilted its head. "Then prove it." Before Lyra could ask what it meant, the ground beneath her feet shifted. Roots shot up from the earth, twisting around her legs. She gasped as a surge of energy rushed through her body. "Lyra!" Kale shouted, drawing his sword, but the spirit raised a hand and Kale froze in place. Lyra's vision blurred. Images flashed before her eyes. Her village burning, the fire crystal shattering, the hooded figures chanting. Then she saw herself standing in a ring of flames, her hands glowing with fiery light. She gasped and looked down. Her hands were glowing now, faint but unmistakable. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. The spirit's voice was calm but firm. "The power of the crystal flows through you. Embrace it or be consumed by it." Lyra closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She focused on the warmth in her chest, the same pull she had felt when the crystal broke. Slowly, the glow in her hands grew brighter. The roots around her legs loosened and fell away. When she opened her eyes, the spirit was gone. The forest was still, as if nothing had happened. Kale rushed to her side. "Are you all right?" Lyra nodded, though she felt unsteady. I think the crystal left something inside me when it shattered." Kale frowned but didn't press her further. "We need to keep moving. The spirits have let us pass, but that doesn't mean we're safe." Lyra followed him, her mind spinning with questions. She didn't know what the power inside her was, but one thing was clear: she couldn't run from it. As they walked, the forest seemed less hostile, the whispers fading into silence. But Lyra knew this was only the beginning of her journey. Whatever had awakened inside her was growing stronger, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. Chapter 4. The Sanctuary of the Sea. The salty breeze carried the sound of crashing waves as Lyra and Cale stood on the edge of a cliff. Below them, the ocean stretched endlessly, its surface glittering under the pale light of dawn. Far out in the water, a small island rose like a jagged tooth, surrounded by swirling mist. "That's it," Cale said, pointing to the island. "The map leads us there. The water crystal fragment must be inside." Lyra squinted at the distant island. "How do we get there?" "I don't see a boat." Cale smirked and held up a coil of rope. "We climb." Lyra groaned as they descended the steep cliff. The rocks were slick with sea spray, and every step felt more dangerous than the last. When they finally reached the shore, Lyra's arms ached, and her clothes were damp from the mist. Cale stepped into the shallow water and pointed to a narrow path of rocks leading toward the island. "This will take us across. Watch your step." The journey across the rocks was slow and nerve-wracking. The waves crashed around them, sending icy sprays of water over their feet. By the time they reached the island, Lyra was shivering, but she pushed on. The entrance to the sanctuary was hidden beneath an arch of coral. As they stepped inside, the air changed. It was cool and still, and the sound of the ocean faded to a distant hum. The walls of the sanctuary sparkled with blue crystals, glowing softly like the light of the moon. In the center of the cavern, a large pool of water shimmered, perfectly calm despite the ocean outside. Lyra approached the pool cautiously. "Do you think the crystal is here?" Cale nodded but didn't say anything. His eyes were fixed on the water, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Suddenly, the surface of the pool rippled, and a deep, melodic voice filled the cavern. "Who dares disturb the sanctuary of the sea?" Lyra stepped back as a massive shape rose from the water. A dragon emerged, its body sleek and shimmering like a fish. Its scales glowed with the same blue light as the walls, and its eyes, bright and piercing, seemed to see straight through her. Cale drew his sword, but the dragon didn't attack. Instead, it tilted its head and spoke again. "I am Nerithus, guardian of the water crystal. If you seek its power, you must prove yourselves worthy." Lyra swallowed hard. "How do we prove ourselves?" The dragon's mouth curled into something like a smile. "By solving my riddles. Fail, and you will never leave this place." Cale scowled. "We don't have time for games." Nerithus's eyes narrowed. "Then leave. The crystal does not belong to the impatient or the unworthy." Lyra put a hand on Cale's arm. "We'll do it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The dragon circled the pool, its tail sending small ripples across the surface. "Listen carefully," it said, its voice echoing through the cavern. "I have cities but no houses, mountains but no rocks, and seas but no water. What am I?" Lyra furrowed her brow, repeating the riddle in her head. Beside her, Cale muttered under his breath, clearly frustrated. "A map," Lyra said suddenly, the answer clicking in her mind. Nerithus paused, then nodded slowly. "Correct. But there is more." The dragon continued, its voice calm but commanding. "The more of me you take, the more you leave behind. What am I? This time Kale answered. Footsteps. Nerithus let out a soft rumble, a sound that might have been approval. You are clever, it said. But cleverness alone will not save you. One final riddle remains. The dragon's glowing eyes fixed on Lyra. I am not alive, but I can grow. I do not breathe, but I need air. What am I? Lyra hesitated. She could feel the pull in her chest again, the same strange energy she had felt in the forest. Closing her eyes, she thought deeply. A flame, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Nerithus was silent for a long moment. Then it lowered its head, the light in its eyes softening. You have passed, it said. The water crystal fragment is yours to take. But be warned, its power comes at a price. Use it wisely, or you will bring only destruction. The dragon sank back into the pool, and the water rippled once more. In the center of the pool, a glowing fragment of the crystal appeared, floating just above the surface. Kale stepped forward cautiously, but Lyra stopped him. I'll take it. She reached out, her hand trembling, and grasped the fragment. As soon as her fingers touched it, a wave of cold energy surged through her, making her gasp. For a moment she saw visions, endless waves drowning cities, and then calm seas under a bright sky. When the vision ended, she was back in the cavern, the fragment glowing faintly in her hand. Kale looked at her, his expression unreadable. Are you all right? Lyra nodded, though her legs felt shaky. Let's go. We have what we need. As they left the sanctuary, the dragon's voice echoed one last time. Beware, travelers. The crystal has chosen you, but others will come to take it. Be ready. Lyra glanced at Kale, her heart heavy with the dragon's warning. She had a feeling their journey was only going to get harder from here. Chapter 5. Betrayals and Deceptions. The campfire crackled softly as Lyra, Kale, and their new companions sat in a circle. The group had grown over the past few days. They now traveled with Eric, a skilled archer with a sharp wit, and Celine, a healer who seemed to know more about magic than she let on. Lyra stared into the flames, her thoughts heavy. The water crystal fragment lay wrapped in cloth beside her, its faint glow barely visible through the fabric. Every step of their journey had brought new dangers, and the weight of their mission felt heavier with each passing day. Eric leaned back, chewing on a piece of dried meat. So, he said casually, what's the plan? We keep wandering through forests and caves. Or are we actually going to face this Lord of Ashes everyone keeps whispering about? Kale showed him a warning look. The less we talk about him, the better. His spies are everywhere. Eric smirked. Relax. We're in the middle of nowhere. Who's going to hear us? Celine cleared her throat, her voice calm but firm. He's right, Eric. This isn't just any enemy. The Lord of Ashes is powerful, and he won't stop until he has the eternal flame. If he gets it, the world will burn. Lyra glanced at Celine. What do you know about the flame? Celine hesitated, then said, the flame is tied to the crystals. It's their source of power, the heart of the elements. If someone controls the flame, they control everything. Fire, water, earth, and air. Eric laughed nervously. Great. So we're up against the most dangerous person in the world. What could go wrong? Kale stood abruptly, his hand on the hilt of his sword. Get some rest. We move at first light. The group settled down for the night, but Lyra couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the flame and the warning from the sea dragon, Nerithus. As the others drifted off, she noticed Eric slipping away from the camp. Curious, she followed him, keeping her steps quiet. He moved quickly through the trees, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching. Lyra's heart pounded. Finally, Eric stopped in a small clearing. He knelt on the ground and pulled a small device from his pack, a glowing crystal communicator. Lyra's stomach sank as he whispered into it. "They have the water crystal fragment," Eric said. "We'll reach the fire temple in 2 days. Be ready." Lyra stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "Eric, what are you doing?" He turned sharply, his face pale. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it, but then his expression hardened. "Stay out of this, Lyra. You don't know what's at stake." Lyra clenched her fists. "You're working for the Lord of Ashes, aren't you? You're going to betray us." Eric sighed. "It's not betrayal. It's survival. Do you really think we can win this fight? The Lord of Ashes is unstoppable. I'm just choosing the winning side." Before Lyra could respond, Cale burst into the clearing, sword drawn. "I knew something was off about you," he growled. Eric stepped back, raising his hands. "Easy, Cale. I wasn't going to hurt anyone." Cale didn't lower his sword. "You've been feeding information to our enemy this whole time. Give me one reason not to end this right now." Eric's eyes flicked to Lyra, then back to Cale. "'Cause you need me. I'm the only one who knows the fastest route to the fire temple." Cale hesitated, and Eric took the opportunity to bolt. He ran into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. Lyra started to follow, but Cale stopped her. "Let him go. He'll lead us to the Lord of Ashes." They returned to the camp, where Celine was waiting, her face grim. "I heard everything," she said. "Eric's betrayal puts us all in danger." Cale nodded. "We have to assume the Lord of Ashes knows where we're going. We need to move now." The group packed up and set off before dawn, following Eric's trail. The path led them to a desolate wasteland, the air thick with ash and smoke. At the heart of the wasteland stood a massive fortress, its towers blackened and crumbling. The sky above it glowed red, as if the land itself was bleeding fire. "The fire temple," Celine whispered. As they approached, the gates of the fortress swung open, and a figure stepped out. He was tall and cloaked in shadow, his eyes burning like embers. "The Lord of Ashes," Cale said, his voice tight. Lyra felt the pull in her chest again, stronger than ever. The water crystal fragment in her pack began to glow, its light spilling out like a beacon. The Lord of Ashes smiled, his voice smooth and menacing. "You've brought me what I seek. How kind of you." Cale drew his sword, and Celine raised her hands, magic crackling at her fingertips. Lyra stepped forward, her fear melting away as the pull in her chest turned into a steady flame. "You can't have it," she said, her voice steady. The Lord of Ashes laughed. "We'll see about that." The ground trembled as fire erupted around them, and the battle began. Chapter 6. The Temple of Stone. The entrance to the Earth Temple was hidden beneath a mountain, concealed by a wall of jagged rocks. Lyra and her companions stood before it, their breaths visible in the chilly air. "Are we sure this is the place?" Lyra asked, looking up at the towering cliffs. Cale unfolded the map and pointed to a symbol etched into the rock, a spiral that matched the markings they'd seen in the water temple. "This is it. The earth crystal fragment is inside." Celine stepped forward, her hand glowing faintly as she traced the spiral with her fingertips. The ground beneath them trembled, and a deep rumble echoed from within the mountain. Suddenly, the rocks shifted, opening into a narrow passageway. The air that flowed out was cool and heavy, carrying the scent of earth and stone. Kale drew his sword. "Stay close. I don't trust this place." The group entered the passage, the walls closing in around them. It felt as though the mountain was alive, breathing in the silence. As they moved deeper, the ground beneath their feet began to shift. The walls seemed to pulse, opening and closing like the muscles of a living creature. "This temple isn't just underground," Celine said, her voice tinged with awe. "It's alive." Lyra touched the wall, feeling its faint vibration. "Alive? How is that possible?" Celine shook her head. "The earth crystal's power. It's connected to the land itself." Suddenly, the passage ahead of them collapsed, blocking their path. Behind them, the entrance sealed shut. Kale cursed under his breath. "We're trapped." Before anyone could respond, the floor began to tilt, throwing them off balance. The temple was moving, reshaping itself into a maze of twisting tunnels. "We need to keep moving," Lyra shouted, pulling Kale to his feet. The group navigated the shifting corridors, the walls groaning and grinding as the temple rearranged itself. It felt as though the mountain was testing them, trying to push them back. Finally, they emerged into a vast chamber. In the center stood a pedestal, and floating above it was the earth crystal fragment, glowing with a deep, golden light. But as Lyra stepped forward, the ground shook violently. A massive stone golem rose from the floor, its body made entirely of jagged rocks and soil. Kale drew his sword, but the golem didn't attack. Instead it spoke, its voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Only the one bound by the earth may claim the crystal. Beat child. Who are you?" Lyra froze, unsure of what to say. Kale and Celine exchanged worried glances, but the golem's glowing eyes were fixed on her. "I'm Lyra," she said hesitantly. "We're here to stop the Lord of Ashes. We need the earth crystal to protect the flame." The golem tilted its head. "Lyra, daughter of the line of Elenith. The earth knows your name." Lyra blinked in surprise. "Elenith? That's my mother's name." The golem's gaze softened. "Your mother's blood carries the mark of the earth. She was a guardian chosen to protect the balance. You are her legacy, and your destiny is bound to the crystals." Lyra's heart pounded. She had always known her mother was strong and wise, but a guardian? She had never spoken of such things. "What does this mean?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling. The golem stepped aside, revealing the crystal fragment. "It means the earth has chosen you. But you must prove your strength. Take the crystal, and the truth will be revealed." Lyra approached the pedestal cautiously. As her hand closed around the fragment, a surge of power coursed through her. Images flashed before her eyes, her mother standing before a glowing crystal, her father holding her as a baby, and then the face of the Lord of Ashes, wreathed in flames. The vision shifted, showing a battle, a fiery storm engulfing the world, with Lyra standing at its center, holding the crystals in her hands. She gasped as the vision ended, the weight of what she had seen sinking in. Kale caught her arm. "Lyra, are you all right?" She nodded, though her legs felt unsteady. "My mother, she was part of this. She knew about the crystals. About the flame." Celine placed a hand on her shoulder. "If your mother was a guardian, then you were always meant to be part of this. The earth has given you its blessing. We need to use it to stop the Lord of Ashes. Before Lyra could respond, the chamber trembled again. The golem turned toward the exit, its voice urgent. The temple has awakened. Leave now or be consumed. The group didn't hesitate. They ran as the walls closed in behind them, the temple collapsing into itself. With Lyra leading the way, the earth seemed to guide them, opening paths where none had been before. They emerged into the open air just as the entrance sealed shut, the mountain rumbling one last time before falling silent. Lyra looked down at the fragment in her hand. It felt heavier than the others, as if it carried not just power, but the weight of her family's legacy. Kale placed a hand on her shoulder. You did well. But we need to keep moving. The Lord of Ashes won't wait. Lyra nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever secrets her family had kept, she would uncover them. And she would use that knowledge to protect the world from the coming storm. Chapter 7: The Broken Sky. The wind was fierce as Lyra and her companions climbed higher into the mountains. Their journey to find the air crystal had taken them to a land of sharp cliffs and endless skies. The air felt thin, and the cold bit at their skin. We're getting close, Kale said, squinting into the distance. The air crystal is up there, beyond the storm. Lyra nodded but couldn't help feeling uneasy. The closer they got, the stronger the wind became, howling like a living creature. She felt like something was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. As they continued their climb, a sudden noise broke through the wind, an eerie sound like wings beating in the air. Lyra turned sharply, her heart racing. From the sky, a dark shape swooped down, followed by more shadows. A group of winged creatures appeared, their bodies covered in black feathers, their eyes glowing red. They were flying straight toward them. Get ready! Kale shouted, drawing his sword. The winged creatures landed with terrifying speed, surrounding the group. Their leader, a tall figure with dark wings, stepped forward. His eyes locked on Kale. You're here at last, the leader said, his voice cold and cruel. We've been waiting for you, Kale. Kale's face hardened. I knew they'd come. Lyra turned to him. Who are they? They're the Sky Riders, Kale said quietly. An army of mercenaries, and they're all loyal to the Lord of Ashes. I used to be one of them. Lyra's eyes widened. You were part of this army. Kale nodded, his grip tightening on his sword. I was once one of their best. But I left. I couldn't continue to fight for the wrong side. They never let me go. The Skyriders closed in, and the leader sneered. You think you can escape your past, Kale? You betrayed us, and now you'll pay the price. Kale stepped forward, raising his sword. I'm not the same man I was. I'll fight to protect the crystals, and I'll stop you from serving the Lord of Ashes. The leader laughed. You think your mission will save this world? You're just another fool trying to stop the inevitable. The Lord of Ashes will rule everything. The battle began. The Skyriders attacked with fierce precision, their weapons gleaming in the harsh light of the storm. Kale fought with all his strength, but Lyra could see the pain in his eyes. The memories of his past were still haunting him, making each strike heavier than the last. As the battle raged, Kale's movements slowed. Lyra noticed it first. Kale, she cried, rushing to his side. The leader of the Skyriders grinned. You still think you can escape us? We own you, Kale. You always will be one of us. Kale's face twisted with anger, but also with something deeper, a shame that he had carried for years. The leader lunged at him, and Kale barely blocked the attack. Lyra's heart raced. She couldn't let him fall. Kale, she shouted again. You're not the man you were. You don't have to fight for them anymore. Cale hesitated for a split second, and that was all the time Lyra needed. She reached out and grabbed his arm, pulling him back. You're stronger than this. You don't have to carry the past. Cale looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than pain in his eyes. You're right, he said quietly. I don't have to fight for them. I can fight for something better. With renewed strength, Cale faced the leader. The Skyriders hesitated, sensing the change in him. In one swift movement, Cale lunged forward and struck the leader down. The rest of the Skyriders hesitated, and Lyra could see fear in their eyes. They're not following you anymore, Cale said, his voice cold. The remaining Skyriders backed away slowly, and then, one by one, they turned and fled into the storm. Lyra breathed a sigh of relief. She turned to Cale, who stood panting, his sword lowered. You did it, she said, her voice soft. Cale looked up at the sky, his eyes distant. I had to face them. But I still have a lot to face. My past, the things I've done. I'm not sure if I'll ever be free from it. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder. You are free, Cale. You've made the right choice. You're fighting for something good now. Cale looked at her, and for the first time he smiled, just a little. Thank you, Lyra. As the storm began to calm, the sky above them broke open, revealing the peak of the mountain where the air crystal fragment waited. We're almost there, Lyra said, her voice full of hope. Cale nodded. Let's finish this. Together they continued their climb, leaving the battle behind them. But for Cale, a part of his past had been left on that mountain, and with each step forward, he felt a little lighter. Chapter 8. The Revelation of the Flame. The path to the fire temple was harder than Lyra had imagined. The land around them was scorched, with cracks in the earth sending up plumes of smoke. The sky above them was red, casting everything in an eerie glow. Lyra, Cale, and Celine pressed forward, their steps heavy with the weight of their journey. They had already gathered the fragments of the other crystals, but the fire crystal was different. It was the last one, and they could feel its power pulling them toward the temple. When they finally reached the entrance, a massive stone door stood before them, covered in ancient runes. Lyra stepped forward and placed her hand on the door. The symbols began to glow, reacting to her touch. This is it, Cale said, his voice tight. The flame is inside. The door creaked open, revealing a vast chamber. In the center, floating above a pool of fire, was the fire crystal. But something was different. It wasn't just a crystal, it was alive. Lyra took a cautious step forward, and the fire crystal pulsed, sending waves of heat through the air. Suddenly, a voice echoed in her mind, deep and powerful. Who dares to seek the flame? Lyra froze, her heart pounding. I am Lyra. I've come for the flame to stop the Lord of Ashes. The voice was quiet for a moment, then it spoke again. The flame is not a weapon to be wielded. It is a force, a living entity. It chooses its own bearer. Lyra felt a shiver run down her spine. Choose me then. I will fight for the world, to protect it from the darkness. The fire crystal pulsed again, and Lyra felt a warmth spread through her body. The heat was intense, but she didn't pull away. Prove yourself, the voice said. Show me that you are worthy. The air around them began to swirl, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The fire crystal shone brighter, sending fiery tendrils reaching out toward Lyra. She had to act quickly. A storm of flames surrounded her, and she felt the heat growing, threatening to burn her alive. But Lyra didn't flinch. She closed her eyes and focused on the power inside her, the connection she had to the crystals. She had always felt it, the pull of the elements, but now it was stronger than ever. She extended her hands, palms open, and as the fire came closer, she let the power of the water and earth crystals flow through her. She could feel the balance of the elements, water, earth, air and fire, all connected. The fire hesitated, then slowly began to calm, as if recognizing her strength. Lyra's body glowed with an inner light, the flames swirling around her like a protective shield. Finally, the storm of fire disappeared, leaving the chamber silent. Lyra opened her eyes, her heart still racing. The fire crystal floated down from its pedestal, coming to rest in her hands. "You are worthy," the voice said. "You have proven your strength. The flame chooses you." Lyra looked down at the fire crystal, its warm glow now pulsing in her hands. She felt its power, but it was no longer threatening. It was like a living thing waiting for her command. Kale and Celine stepped forward, their expressions filled with awe. "You did it," Kale said, his voice filled with wonder. Lyra nodded, her grip tightening around the crystal. "We're not done yet. The Lord of Ashes still has to be stopped." But deep inside, Lyra knew that this was only the beginning. The flame had chosen her, and with it, she carried the weight of the world. She had to be ready for what was coming. As they left the fire temple, the sky began to clear, the red haze lifting, revealing the first signs of dawn. Lyra felt a sense of hope rising within her, but also the knowledge that a final battle awaited them, one that would determine the future of everything. Chapter 9. The Final Battle. The air was thick with tension as Lyra and her companions stood at the entrance of the ancient temple where the eternal flame lay dormant. The fire crystal, now in Lyra's hands, pulsed with a steady, powerful rhythm. The world had changed, and they could all feel it. "We don't have much time," Kale said, his voice serious. "The Lord of Ashes is coming." Lyra nodded, her heart pounding. She knew that this was the moment they had been preparing for. The fate of the world rested on this battle. If they failed, the Lord of Ashes would gain control of the flame, and darkness would consume everything. Suddenly the ground trembled. Dark clouds gathered overhead, blocking out the sun. The air grew colder, and Lyra could hear the distant sound of marching feet. An army was coming. "We need to hold them off," Lyra said, gripping the fire crystal tighter. The power of the flame surged within her, and she could feel its energy connecting with the other crystals she had gathered. It was time to fight. As the army of the Lord of Ashes appeared on the horizon, Lyra and her allies prepared for the battle ahead. Kale stood beside her, his sword drawn and ready. Celine, her magical powers glowing, stood on the other side. They weren't alone. A small army of rebels and allies who had joined their cause gathered around them, ready to defend the flame. The first wave of soldiers charged forward, but Kale and Lyra were quick to react. Kale sliced through the enemies with his sword, his movements precise and deadly. Lyra, drawing on the power of the crystals, summoned blasts of fire and earth, sending waves of destruction toward the advancing army. "Hold them back," Celine shouted, her voice filled with determination. She raised her hands and summoned a barrier of air, protecting their forces from incoming attacks. But the Lord of Ashes wasn't just sending soldiers. His dark magic twisted the land itself, causing the ground to crack open and release fiery creatures that charged at them with terrifying speed. "We need to stop the magic at its source," Lyra said, her voice urgent. Kale nodded. "I'll lead the way. You need to protect the flame, Lyra. Don't let anyone get close to it." Lyra hesitated but then nodded. She could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She was the chosen bearer of the flame, and she couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. The battle raged on. Lyra summoned firestorms to clear the path ahead, while Kale fought fiercely against the dark creatures. The ground beneath them shook as the Lord of Ashes approached, his form dark and twisted. His eyes burned with hatred and power. "You think you can stop me?" The Lord of Ashes' voice echoed through the battlefield. His army continued to pour in, threatening to overwhelm them. Lyra felt the flame's power surge in response. She closed her eyes and reached out, calling upon the strength of the other crystals, earth, water, and air. With a burst of energy, she unleashed a wave of elemental force that pushed back the army. But the Lord of Ashes was not done yet. He raised his hands, and dark shadows erupted from the ground, forming into monstrous shapes. The creatures charged forward with terrifying speed, but Lyra stood firm. "I won't let you take it," she said, her voice filled with resolve. The Lord of Ashes laughed darkly. "You're just a child, Lyra. You can't stand against me." But as he spoke, something within Lyra clicked. The flame wasn't just a force, it was a part of her now. She felt its power coursing through her, and with that power, she summoned a final wave of energy, stronger than anything she had ever done before. The fire swirled around her, the other elements joining in a storm of pure, uncontrollable power. The battlefield seemed to freeze as the Lord of Ashes was consumed by the light. His army faltered, their dark magic overwhelmed by the force Lyra had summoned. The Lord of Ashes screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the elements crashing together. When the light finally faded, the Lord of Ashes was gone, and the battlefield was silent. The army he had sent to destroy them scattered, defeated. The dark clouds overhead slowly began to lift, and the sun began to shine through once more. Lyra collapsed to her knees, exhausted. The power of the flame had drained her, but she had succeeded. She had protected the eternal flame from falling into the wrong hands. Kale knelt beside her, his expression softening. "You did it, Lyra." She smiled weakly, looking at the fire crystal in her hands. It was still glowing brightly, a symbol of her victory. "The world is safe," Lyra said quietly. Selene approached, her face full of relief. "You've saved us all. The Lord of Ashes is gone, and with him the darkness." But even as they celebrated, Lyra knew that this victory was only one part of a much larger journey. The balance of the elements had been restored, but the world would always need protectors. And as long as the flame still burned, there would always be challenges ahead. But for now the world was safe. And that was enough. Chapter 10. The Age of Renewal. The battle was over. The land was quiet once more, the dark clouds of the Lord of Ashes slowly fading away, and the sun shone through, warming the earth. Lyra stood alone at the center of the battlefield, the fire crystal still glowing in her hands. The others had retreated to the village to rest, but Lyra remained, staring at the crystal. The world was safe for now. The Lord of Ashes was gone. His army had been defeated, and peace had returned. But even as she stood there, Lyra felt the weight of the decision that lay before her. The fire crystal, the eternal flame, was in her hands. She had fought for it. She had protected it. But now she had to decide its future. The flame was more than just a weapon. It was a living force, powerful beyond imagining. With it, she could restore balance to the world, heal the land, and bring about a new age of prosperity. But there was also a darker side. The flame could corrupt, just as it had been used by the Lord of Ashes to bring destruction. Lyra's heart was torn. She had already given so much. The battle had cost her, and now the choice seemed impossible. Should she destroy the flame to prevent anyone from using it again? Or should she use its power to rebuild the world, knowing that with great power came great danger? As she stood there, deep in thought, Cale approached, his footsteps quiet on the ground. He had been watching her from a distance, but now he felt it was time to speak. "You've saved us, Lyra," Cale said softly. "You've protected the flame. Now you have to choose." Lyra turned to face him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what to do, Cale. The flame is powerful. If I use it, I could heal the world, bring back the balance we've lost. But what if I can't control it? What if it destroys everything we've fought for?" Cale stepped closer, his voice gentle. "You're not alone. You've brought us this far, and we believe in you. You've proven that you can handle this power. But it's your decision, Lyra. You're the one who holds the flame." Lyra looked down at the glowing crystal in her hands. The fire flickered in a rhythm that almost felt like a heartbeat. She knew that she had the strength to make the right choice. But was there even a right choice? Was the flame a blessing or a curse? Suddenly, a voice echoed in her mind, the voice of the flame itself. "You have come so far, Lyra. You have shown courage, strength, and wisdom. Now you must decide what happens next. But know this, whatever you choose, the world will be forever changed." The voice was calm, but Lyra could feel the weight of the words. She understood that this moment would define not only her future but the future of everyone. For a long time Lyra stood there, unsure. Then she made her decision. She closed her eyes and let the power of the flame flow through her. She felt its heat, its energy, but also its sense of purpose. The flame had chosen her, but now it was time for her to make the ultimate choice. Lyra stepped forward, the crystal held high above her head. "I will restore balance. I will bring peace to this world. The flame will not be destroyed, but it must be used wisely, carefully, for the good of all." The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, as if the world itself was responding to her decision. With a burst of light, the flame's energy spread out, sending waves of warmth and healing through the land. The broken earth began to heal, the burned forests slowly began to grow back, and the rivers that had dried up from the Lord of Ashes' magic began to flow again. Lyra felt the power of the flame surge inside her, but she knew she could control it now. She was not alone. She had her friends, and she had the strength to protect the world from falling into darkness again. Cale stood beside her, watching as the land around them slowly returned to life. "You did it," he said, his voice full of awe. Lyra smiled. "We did it. We all did." But even as the world was healing, Lyra knew there was still much work to be done. The flame had changed everything, and its power was not something to be taken lightly. She would watch over it, keep it safe, and make sure it was used for good. "Now we start a new journey," Lyra said, turning to face the horizon. "The world is ours to rebuild." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light across the land, Lyra and her companions stood together. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, hope filled their hearts. The flame had not destroyed the world. It had given them the chance to rebuild it. And with that, the age of renewal began.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe,